Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Leadership Matters, a weekly half-hour series aimed at supporting leaders. I'm Dr. Kenroy Burt, your host, and I'm excited this evening to have with me Marjorie Wharton, transformational coach and transition specialist. We are going to be talking some really good stuff. Tell somebody that we are on so that you wouldn't miss this moment. But before we go any further, let's pause for a cause.
Crumb's Bakery, so good, even down to the last crumb.
So, welcome back to our program this evening. As I said to you, we are talking to Marjorie Wharton, transformational coach and transition specialist. And we are looking a little bit at leadership transitions in a VUCA world. As we know, a VUCA world is a world that is characterized by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And this evening, we want to make a little bit sense about it, and we are going to have this conversation with Marjorie. But before we get into those intricacies, let's talk a little bit to Marjorie about who is Marjorie Wharton.
All right. Well, good evening, Dr. Burke. A pleasure to be here with you this evening and to have the opportunity to talk about these very important topics, as you say, at this very interesting time in our history. So, to tell you a little bit about me, I was born and raised in Barbados. I've grown up here my entire life, spent here. I have traveled. As I always say to people, I travel, but I always come back home. This has always been home base for me. I think that because of that, having gone, let's say, gone to school in Barbados and having gone to university in Barbados, I've had the opportunity to kind of look out on the world and interact with people from across the world. Because as you know, Barbados is really like a cross, an intersection where a lot of people come together. It gives you an interesting perspective, I think, when you grow up in a small island, but you have that
Mhm.
focus on what's going on in the rest of the world. And so I think that that has been the perspective that I've developed as well. A little bit more about me. I grew up as an only child. And no, I was not spoiled. I was raised by my grandparents. And that
Well, you were
also, at the
definitely
time,
spoiled. So you were
I
definitely
was
spoiled
not.
being raised with grandparents.
And so that gave me an interesting perspective because
Mhm.
my grandparents, having grown up in, well, my grandmother was born in 1922 and my grandfather was born in 1918. So they grew up in the 30s and 40s when
Mhm.
times were really rough in the world as well. And so they had these perspectives where you would learn how to make do with what you had. You
Mhm.
would you worry about being perfect because you don't have opportunities to create wastage. You would worry also about risks. You don't want to take unrealistic risks because you don't have
Mhm.
resources to recover all of the time. And so I think a lot of that fed into me as I was growing up. And it wasn't always in a positive way. A lot of it was, but a lot of it too led me then to the perspective where I worried about perfectionism. If I wasn't perfect, I felt that something wasn't happening as it should, and I would be more cautious when it comes to doing anything or stepping quote unquote outside of the box, and wanted to toe the line and be that kind of
Mhm.
person who wouldn't stray too far from midpoint where
Mhm.
it's safe. So I felt a lot of that informed who I was as I was growing up. And it
Yeah.
then meant that as I developed as an adult going into a workplace, I had to get rid of all of those ideas. So
Yeah,
all of the things that
makes
brought me
sense.
to adulthood, yeah, I then had to get rid of all of those.
Yeah, yeah, understood, understood. Um, Marjorie, as the story seems to be going so well, let's talk a little bit about Marjorie's leadership journey,
Yeah.
how she got where she is today as a transformational coach and transition specialist. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I can really start that. You're absolutely right. It's like the story continues because really for me to move from being that kind of child who was so focused on not making mistakes and not
Mhm.
or being perfect as much as I possibly could. The challenge then is that when you go into the workplace, if you're focused on being perfect and not making mistakes, then you're not going to get ahead in an organization.
Yeah,
Because in an organization, you have to be willing to try new things. You have to be willing to try to do things differently.
yeah.
And for me, that was probably one of the first things that I had to learn. And I had to make that shift fairly early in my
Mhm.
career in order to be able to do anything and achieve anything at work. And fortunately, I was able to do that. So I learned that you had to start, you had to be willing to step up, you had to be willing
Mhm.
to speak up, and you have to
Mhm.
be willing to try things.
Yeah.
Now, I was fortunate as well when I started working that I had a boss who was willing to be a mentor and willing to guide me. I used to work at the Cave Hill School of Business at the University of the West Indies. So it was a developmental environment. And the CEO of the organization was very focused on making sure that you built skills, you acquired knowledge, and you acquired
Mhm.
capability. And a lot of the times to do that, you had to do it in a practical way. So it wasn't that you sat down and she told you what to do it, she would throw you into, well, there's this thing that
Yeah.
needs to be done, off you go. And you go, what? But you can come back and ask any questions, but you have to go do it. And so when I'm coaching people now, I say a lot of the times to them that you can't stand on the sidelines
Yeah.
and learn. Sometimes you have to put your foot into the pool if you don't want to jump in and at least
Yeah.
start the process of going forward. And that was one of those things that I had to learn as well. Now, at the business school, I started in a kind of a simple role where my responsibility was more like event management, coordinating, and administration. And then throughout the years while I was there, I got to a position where I was taking on more responsibility. I was able to build a team that reported to me, and I was really then widening my reach, my span of control within the organization. So a lot of what I learned and I evolved into came about from my experiences over the years working in the environment and facing and dealing with challenges. Now, my journey to becoming a coach was one that happened, I guess, later on in life, later on in my career. I was always
Mhm.
into training. I was always into facilitation. So I worked with people to help them build their leadership skills. I worked with people to develop strategic plans. That's the training and facilitation area. But the coaching came a lot later when I recognized that there really needs to be a bridge between knowing and doing. And for a lot of that, people need the kind of support that a coach can provide.
Oh, what wonderful story. The thing about it is, what your story shows is that there are no mistakes being made as you move from one place to another. And this
Yeah.
evening we want to talk a little bit about that transitions, the
Hmm.
whole transition that leaders today are forced to make. Now, Marjorie, we are in a very very interesting situation. As I said, we're in a VUCA world, and one of the
Yeah.
things that we know is that leaders are oftentimes forced to navigate transitions, consistently navigate transitions in this period. Let's talk a little bit about how leaders can actually guide these transitions as we move through this interesting time.
Yeah. Well, one of the first things that we have to say to anybody who's going through transitions right now is don't panic,
Mhm.
because it can be overwhelming. So, what you've described in terms of volatility and uncertainty, when people get into a situation where things aren't stable and they're constantly changing, and you really feel like you have no control, sometimes people do start to worry and they start to make
Yeah,
moves that they would not make if they were thinking clearly. So that is why it's important that you don't get into that panicked frame of mind as you are going through this process. Uncertainty, it means that you're not sure where you're going to go, and people aren't sure that they can do anything now in order to
yeah,
put themselves in a better position for the future. But it is important that you at least start with what you know. don't assume that everything you're going to do has to be big and massive change. Start at least with what you know and learn as you go. That's one thing I'm always saying to people: start small and build up. Because oftentimes we think that if we need to make any kind of change, that we have to be able to know how to do everything to deal with it right now. And the way that the world is now, with all the uncertainty, there's no way that you know everything to do with
Yeah.
it. There's no way that you possibly know everything you need to do now to prepare yourself for where the pandemic is going to have us in a year. We have no idea. But what we know that we can do, we can communicate with people, we can share information, we can try to explain what is going on so that people are have awareness and they can have some level of comfort with that knowledge. And that at least gives people, everyone, a position that they can feel, okay, everything's uncertain, but at least I know as much as there is for me to know right now. So I think that awareness, communication, sharing information is key for any leader who is in a situation that they're going through transition. Because if you are not telling your people what's happening, believe me, somebody is. And in the absence of truth, people will fill that void with whatever information they feel they can get. So I would
Now,
say that is the first thing to any leader leading people through transition.
now, Marjorie, we're gonna pause for a cause, but when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about that whole concept of start with what you know. But we're gonna pause
Hmm.
for a cause at this time. Welcome back. This is Leadership Matters, and we're having a conversation this evening with Marjorie Wharton. She's a transformational coach and transition specialist. And just about the time we took a break, I was asking Marjorie to let's elaborate a little bit on the whole concept of leaders starting with what they know. Now, Marjorie, one of the things I will say to you up front and center is that is not necessarily the most confident place to start with what you know,
Mm.
because you like to feel as though you have tackled all the things you don't know. And if what you
Mm.
know is very, very, very little in comparison to
Yeah.
all that you don't know, it becomes even
Yep.
more challenging. But I want
Yeah.
you to elaborate a little bit. Why is it so important that we delve into what we know?
Yeah. And I like the fact that you mentioned that a lot of us, when we're going through change, we want to try and control everything. So we want to think we have the knowledge to deal with the things that we do not know. But I agree with you. That is, even though it's uncomfortable, it's not wise to do that. The reason why it's better for you to start with what you know is because you then at least have a good enough understanding to implement effectively. And where a lot of problems happen whenever you're doing change, it is the actual implementation and doing where people tend to fall down. So if you are starting with what you know, you at least are building on a foundation in an area where you feel confident.
Yeah.
Yes, there's still a whole lot of things that you do not know, but that does not mean that you can't at least be working on this little corner of the problem, this little corner of the issue. Because you will find when change is happening, if you can get at least one part that you're comfortable and you're confident in, then you can take the next step. But if you are feeling all the time like nothing is sure and nothing is certain, it becomes more difficult to move forward. So that's why you should start with what you know.
Okay, understood, understood. Now, there are some leaders who are not known necessarily dealing with transitions from a macro perspective, from a company organizational perspective, but they're dealing with personal transitions.
Mm-hmm.
Probably transition in the mind of trying to work with persons who are now working from at home, or feeling as though there's a loss of control of the space, the work space, feeling as though certain marks are consistently moving. There's several things that are happening in this space. And one of the things that I've taken note of is I often ask who's talking to the leaders. I know that they're transformational coaches like you, but who's talking to those leaders? Because several persons don't have coaches and several persons
Mhm.
don't experience this. But what would you say to that person? What advice would you give that person, that leader who is navigating a personal transition at this period of time, whether it be through the VUCA concept world or otherwise? What would you
Okay.
say to them?
All right. Well, I'm going to step back a little to say this piece before I answer that. Just know
Mhm.
this: for anyone going through any kind of change, even if it's organizational change, all change is personal.
Ah,
Because I think a lot of people aren't thinking about that when they're thinking about large scale change. They're just thinking about
yeah.
what they need to do for the organization. But in order for it to work on a large scale, each and every single individual has to make an internal and a personal change for it to work. So
Mhm.
then coming back now to the person who perhaps is dealing with transition in their personal life. And so they're not thinking about it then on a work scale. It I have to say this to you first and foremost, don't take it personally.
Mhm.
And that's important because a lot of us, we take change personally. If you are going along and suddenly your organization goes under and they had to make a decision about laying off some people and you're amongst the numbers that are laid off, it can
Mhm.
feel to you like, well, I've put in my 20 years, why they're picking on me. But
Yeah.
remember, it's not personal. Don't take it personally. That's one. And then, secondly, in addition to the fact that you shouldn't take it personally, please understand that there's nothing wrong with whatever emotion you're feeling. So if you feel like crap, if you feel angry, if you are upset over how things have happened, that is perfectly normal and it is perfectly okay. And one of the things that you want to do is feel that emotion, deal with it, and move on. Because the moving on is where you can then move forward and really make things happen in your life. If you find that you are stuck there all the time, just dealing with the emotion and talking about, look at
Mhm.
what they did to me, look at how they're treating me, that's not good for you. So you want to be in a position where you can let that go and move forward. And the thing about transition and change, making or dealing with personal change that happens in your life, you often have to be prepared to respond to things that you never expected you might be dealing with,
Yeah.
especially now in the kinds of situations that we are. And so it means that you have to look back in your history, look back in your experiences, and say to yourself, well, what do I now have that could help me cope with this? Because oftentimes we have had experiences, we have knowledge, we have capabilities that could help us, but because we've not experienced something exactly like this before, we're not sure. And
Mhm.
maybe you can't do it on your own. You might need assistance. So, yes, if you're not in a position that you have a coach that you can work with, do you have a friend you can talk to? Do you have a family member who can help you? Can you go talk to your priest or pastor at the church who may also be a counselor? Somebody who can help you just to think a little more clearly and see yourself a little more clearly. Because often, we have possibilities that lay right there before us that we don't see for ourselves because we don't see ourselves clearly. So having somebody help you with that can help you deal with that kind of transition. And I think those would be my first three things that I would say to anybody who's going through that kind of transition. Don't take it personally.
Yeah.
Don't stay there. Your emotions are fine, but don't stay with them. And
Mhm.
then get to a point where you look into your history for your skills and your capabilities and think about how they can help you take the next step.
What you said, Marjorie, that it is also important for you to have persons who can help you. How important then is someone like a transformational coach at this period?
Well, I will say this, and it might be difficult for some people to accept, but usually we as human beings always assume that we know all the answers and that
Hmm.
we have all the answers within us. Yet, still, when it comes to dealing with problems, we don't go within and actually look for the answer. We just kind of get upset with ourselves and respond to the situation, or react
Mm-hmm.
to the situation rather than respond. And so a transformational coach would sit with an individual and help them to see the value that is within them, the value
Yeah,
that they are ignoring. And once they put you on the path to do that, then you are in a better place to do it repeatedly for yourself.
yeah.
And in case you don't already know this, for those of you listening, in case you don't already know this, a lot of people who are coaches also have to have people coaching them. And we do that because we recognize that there is value in having assistance, having somebody outside of you help you to see what is there, that is right there in front of you, that sometimes you don't even see for yourself. So I think the value of having a coach work with someone is to help them see themselves more clearly and see their path forward more clearly.
Fantastic. We're going to take another break, another pause for a cause, and then as we come back, we're going to have an extremely exciting time as we close off this evening's program.
Here's some of your best news since the lockdowns. 7 Crumbs Bakery locations are now open on Sundays and bank holidays from 7 in the morning. They are Eagle Hall, Wildy, Fairchild Street, Oystons, My Lord's Hill, Speightstown and Fairview, while the other 10 Crumbs locations open Monday to Saturday as usual. Crumbs for a wide variety of fresh cakes, pastries and bread. Crumbs, so good, even down to the last crumb.
And welcome back. Now, Marjorie, now you were just talking to us about change and transitions, etc. And I'm going to ask you a question, personal question. What is the biggest transition that Marjorie has had to deal with over the years, over the time, her leadership journey, I mean, personally, whatever it is, what would you consider to be probably that greatest transition that you've been forced to deal with as a leader? But interestingly, also, I would want to know, and I think that there are others who are listening here who would want to know, how did you manage with the entire process?
Okay. Well, that one's a little easier than you might think, because while I've had a lot of transitions that I've dealt with over the years, I think the most recent big transition I've had in my life is probably maybe one of the biggest. So I worked at the Cape Hill School of Business at the University of the West Indies. I worked there for a very long time. Um, and then, because of the pandemic, because of what was happening and so on, with there no longer being a need for face to face training and those types of programs, the organization made the decision that they didn't have to have me as a full time member of their team anymore. And so that happened in July of 2020. So at the end of July 2020, I was officially no longer an employee of an organization that I had worked with for, I'll go ahead and say it, for over 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
So um, it was interesting. And I have to say that I'm still processing some things. What
Mm-hmm.
was interesting for me as part of the change was moving from being an employee to being someone who is self employed. It is an entirely different mindset. And having spent decades having to go with a work routine of, you get up to get to work at a specific time, you have lunch at a specific time, you knock off from work at a specific time, even if it's later than 4:30, there's still an end point, and there's a place that you work, and then you come home. What has been one of the biggest shifts for me is recognizing that I no longer have to follow that routine. And it was interesting because for the first few months or so um, after I wasn't a full-time employee, I still had this orientation, like you had to be up and sitting in front of the computer and doing something. You had to be on the job at 8:30. And
Yeah.
it took a long time for me to make the transition in my mind that I no longer have to do that. I can choose to do that, but I don't have to do that. And so when I tell people that change takes time, we talk about our brains and how it works and the connections in our brain and how hard it is for us to make mental shifts once we've built habits up over the years. You really, I can see it in everything that has happened to me in the last year and a few months, because even though I know it, actually seeing it and actually going through it has been interesting. So I'm still kind of peeling back the layers of
Hmm.
recognizing that I now can create the work day that I want. And I don't have to follow the rules of what the organization is saying that my work day must look like. So that's why I say all the time that change is a process and
Yeah.
change takes time. It's not easy.
So there's Marjorie, you know that there are some others out there. There are other persons out there who may be walking through the same space right now.
Yeah.
We are in that type of world where persons are, and part of organizational agility is okay. We're gonna rethink what we currently do because we may not need all of this, and then that's part of the package. But what would you say to that person then who feels stuck? They feel stuck. They have not yet gotten over it. July
Yeah.
2020, a year later, and I still have not gotten over it. What would you say to that person?
Start working on getting over it. And
Hmm.
I'll tell
Yeah.
you why I say it that way. For me, what made it work for me or what made it happen for me, I told the story recently online. If you remember what happened with the gymnast Simone Biles and the fact that she was willing to walk away from what was expected of her, and she just made a decision and made a shift. When that happened for me, at first it was a shock that anybody would be so willing to just step away from everything they had worked
Mhm.
for so long. But then, in the midst of my kind of working that through in my brain, it occurred to me, but that is what you say you want in your life. That is the change that you say
Mhm.
you want. You
Yeah.
have to be willing to create the kind of life that you want. And I'm saying I want the freedom to create the kind of life I want. So, why was that such a shock for me? So, for anybody else who feels like they are stuck, I will ask them to consider how is it you want your life to be? And why have you not taken that step? And maybe you, like me, need to look for an example of somebody who is living their life the way that you want to. See someone who has made the sacrifice and made the change, and then ask yourself, well, why can't I do that too?
Yeah.
Because I think that's the hardest part. It's not so much that we can't do it, but we still are stuck in the old habit and the whole way of thinking, the old way of thinking. And so to get to a new way of thinking, you have to ask yourself, well, why not? Because know that when it comes to structuring your life, that you do have the power to make the decision about how you want to work and how you want your day to look. And it's
Now
not
those are
easy.
some
I know.
powerful.
Easier. I know it's easier
Yeah.
said than done, but it is possible.
Yeah. And I think we empathize with that person this evening, but to
Yeah.
get them moving and help them to see that there is a bright future ahead, you oftentimes need to let them know, you know what, let's keep moving. Don't worry about it. Let's keep moving. Now,
Yeah.
Marjorie, we're going to pause one last time for a cause, and then there is a very interesting question that I have for you.
Okay.
And welcome back. Now, Marjorie, I want you to talk to Marjorie as she was about to spend 20 years at the university. Talk to her from your position today and advise her concerning the possible transitions that might be coming her way. Probably you never know 2 decades after.
Oh, wow, that is such an interesting question.
Mhm.
I would tell Marjorie to relax. Don't worry. You don't have to know all the answers. Just
Mhm.
keep putting one foot in front of the other. take every opportunity that you can to learn new and different things, to meet new and different people, because you never know when those skills or capabilities may come in handy to you at some point in the future. Um, Sleep more. Stop assuming that if you work till 10 o'clock at night, that the work tomorrow will be less on your desk. That you have to be willing to do a lot more self care. You have to be willing to take the vacation days when you are supposed to, because it helps you to think more clearly and come up with better ideas. And don't make the decision that you are not going to have a side hustle, because it could be interesting for you to have a side hustle that you can fall back on in case, 20 years down
Yeah,
the road change happens, and
yeah.
you would be in a really good position to step off into that side hustle and make it full time. I think that's what
Fantastic.
I would tell Marjorie 20 years ago.
And Marjorie is saying, thank you so very much for that advice. So thank you so very much, Marjorie Wharton, transformational coach and transition specialist. We had a wonderful discussion with her this evening
My
on
pleasure.
leadership matters. I encourage you to check us out on Facebook, check us out on our Instagram page. We are doing lots of great things supporting leaders. This has been Leadership Matters, and I am Dr. Ken Royberg. God bless you.